Welcome to Best of Three. I'm StillJustMike. This is an esports podcast by Organized Gaming where we speak with industry experts from all over the constantly changing world of esports. Today's going to be a little different than our usual format. Today, I'm the only Organized Gaming boy on the podcast, but with me today are two individuals from different, but I would say very complementary sections of esports. On one side, we have a mental performance consultant from Vertex Performance. We've got Landon Gorbenko. Landon, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And then on the other side, we've got a performance consultant from Boxout Performance. We've got Casey. Is it Pickard?
Correct.
Hey, Casey Pickard is here. Glad to have you.
Appreciate you having me.
So what I wanted to do, I wanted to kind of get into the mental performance side of esports, because it's something that I feel like is not looked at or not highlighted nearly enough. And so I wanted to kind of get you guys' opinions on that. So I want to start by just kind of getting a little bit of both of your background. So I'm actually going to start with you, Casey. Casey, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Boxout?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a lot of people in esports now, my original background came in traditional sports. When we were kids, everyone wanted to play video games, but no one was really equipped with the infrastructure to turn it into a competitive hobby or even a profession, which is now obviously at the forefront of esports. Mm-hmm. So when I was younger, playing pretty elite level sports, I played through high school in both baseball and basketball. Wow. What you might not be able to see right now is I'm 5'9" with, we'll generously say, a limited athletic ability. But for some reason, I was able to compete with guys who actually went on to play in the NBA and in the minor leagues of baseball, things like that. And the reason is not because I was physically faster and I could jump higher and I was stronger, but it really came down to the fact that from a mental and cognitive and visual perspective, I was able to exceed the levels that these guys who had the physical gifts were competing on. Okay. So when I came across Boxout, I saw a natural synergy. I saw the things in myself that I was able to use as a competitive advantage against others. And I said, well, these are the things that not only do other esports athletes need to possess and train, but they're things that the organizations themselves need to be able to identify. Mm-hmm. Because I can't tell you how many times I walked into a tryout, a couple of guys looked around and said, don't waste your time. We won't waste yours. Don't waste ours. You could just head on out. I see. And I said, no, just give me an hour and maybe you'll like what you see. Sometimes it worked out. Obviously, sometimes it didn't. I didn't make every team I tried out for, but I certainly made more than I was expected to. So Boxout is essentially helping organizations and individuals identify these visual, cognitive, and psychological things that you need to perform at a high level. They're helping you train them and then develop those skills, not only from an individual perspective, but from a team and an organizational perspective.
So tell me about how the transition or addition of esports happened at Boxout.
Well, I think there's a gentleman there who's on the board, who's high up in the organization. His name is Victor Runov. He actually started as a competitive gamer early on in the life cycle of such an ecosystem. And when he came across Boxout, he said, these are the things that I need, because everyone at that point was putting in hours. Everyone says, 10,000 hours, you can master a task. Right. But if I'm a competitive gamer putting in 12 hours a day of practice, and so are you, and so is everyone else in the room, what's your competitive advantage? Right. Other than the natural things you brought to the table, as I said, in traditional sports, being 6'6" and having a 40-inch vertical.
Natural talent, yeah. Yes,
exactly. What's the differential in esports? And part of the great thing about esports is that the field is, the playing field is so level. Mm-hmm. If you can sit down and you have the ability to play, then it doesn't matter your size, your disposition, anything like that. But searching for that competitive advantage became paramount. And when he came across Boxout, he said, this is a natural fit. This is something I can see blowing up, because frankly, everyone's just logging hours. And if you go to a professional sports organization or anywhere else, you'll know that it's not just 2 hours of scrimmage in a practice. Right. A lot of the skill building is done off the field or off the court or off the ice. And then a lot of the things on the playing surface are also individualized for skill development, not just let's play a game for 2 hours. Right. So we're trying to show everyone in esports, competitors and organizations alike, that beyond just practicing the game, which is paramount still, it's not the exclusive way to train and develop your talents.
So there's a methodology behind it.
Exactly. It's science-backed, it's performance-based, and there's plenty of methodology.
Right. Okay. And so last thing, I guess, before we move on to Landon. So what is it that you do day to day in Boxout?
So my day-to-day operations, I would say, would be identifying beyond, after I identify the organization that I think could fit, once we get them to take an assessment, which is really the first thing anyone should do, is get a baseline test and realize where you are, because you can't get to where you're going if you don't know where you started. So beyond that, after we administer all these tests, as I said before, visual, cognitive, psychological, and mental, we sort of build out a training program for them based on their individualized results. Okay. So my job is to interpret the data, deploy it, and apply it applicably. And once we get through that, it's to help them in their day-to-day, sort of as an account manager, so to speak, to help them get the most out of this training program, realize how's the best way to deploy it, and then adjust it accordingly as you go. Because once you get stronger in certain areas, you need to change your approach and adjust.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Very nice. And then let's also speak with Landon for a bit. Landon, tell us about Vertex and tell us about you and your background.
All right. Let me jump to the background real quick of what I did.
Please.
Originally, kind of much like him, I came from a traditional sport background, but I had a much deeper passion in esports rather than I did traditional sports. I was obsessed with it ever since I was a little kid.
I see.
My cousins, in fact, are the ones that got me into it because they were much older than me. So they brought in like Mario back in the NES or Halo in 2001 when it came out. And I fell in love competing against them because they were so much older and I'd always got like wiped by them. And I just kind of, it grew my passion for esports. And I always played traditional sports growing up all the way through high school and college. But esports was where my true passion lied. Then I went into university, kind of initially was going in for psychology, which I got my bachelor's in science and psychology, was going to go through that process all the way through, become like a typical kind of counselor or clinical psychologist. Nearing the end of that degree, I was like, that's not where I'm going. I need to find something else. I went around talking to a bunch of people and I found a lady who she works with a lot of like the Canadian Olympians and a lot of professional athletes in Canada.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, tell me about your job. What is it? How do I do it? I just want to see if this is what I want to do. And she explained everything. And I knew like that moment, that's what I wanted to do. So she did her master's in something called sport and performance psychology. And I was like doing the same thing. Let's go. So I went with that kind of with the anticipation of doing traditional sports. Cause still for whatever reason, even though esports was my passion, I didn't realize that this was a thing in esports yet,
it's hard, right? It's hard to think, oh wait, I can actually make a career out of this. Like,
yeah, exactly. And so I was in my master's doing all the things, doing like the sport research, doing all the sport literature and writing papers on sport. And then one day it clicked and I was sitting in class and we had to do a paper. I can't remember what it was, but something on like an elite, right? Like somebody that's elite in sport. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Bjergsen from League of Legends just popped into my mind completely out of the blue. Cause if I'm not mistaken, he was a 17-year-old kid that dropped out of high school, moved from Denmark to LA to compete.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think that's how the story goes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this will be a great case study because this was a case study kind of paper. And so I started doing research on it and I brought up all my like fact sheets and information. I was like bringing it to my professor, a little bit nervous, handshaking because he's a sport jock more or less.
Right.
Let's not get it wrong. But present him. I was like, this is what I want to do. It's esports. What do you think? And he's like, oh, that's cool. Go for it. So I wrote the paper on it and it was great. Did a good grade on it. Awesome. Kind of mixed matched with the sport and esports side going forward throughout the rest of my master's. Then came my dissertation project. I was like, you know what? Esports, let's go. So I put together my entire methodology, my entire plan for the research project. And I went back to him and I was a little bit nervous again because I was like, this is a little bit more upscale. Like this is the thing that I have to do for my master's. Is he going to be okay with esports on this one? And I sit down and I tell him like, I want to do mental fatigue using a competitive video gamer demographic. And he's like, that's awesome. Let's go. And I was like, oh, let's go. Right. So I got really, really excited about that. So I conducted an entire research project based on the effects of mental and cognitive fatigue on competitive esports. And it was fascinating. And from that moment on, I was like, All right, esports I think is my path. But after that, I still kind of dabbled in the traditional sport world. That's what I was working with exclusively as I came out of my master's.
Yeah.
Then just one day it was just like, no, if I want to do esports, I can't wait for it to happen. I gotta go for it.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much I booked a flight 2 weeks later or whatever it was, and then flew out to Toronto, got established because esports doesn't exist out west yet, or at least not in my hometown.
Really?
So I just full committed to Toronto. Had no idea what was going to happen.
I didn't know you moved here.
Yeah, I sure did. Because I'm from Calgary.
Yeah.
And I was just like, you can't do esports in Calgary. It doesn't exist yet. It's starting to. You can see the roots kind of sprouting
here and there.
It was either Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. So it's just I had to pick one, and I ended up in Toronto and just full committed.
I like the idea of everything kind of developed through university, like very, very gradually. You started out with like, what about this? Can I try this esports related project? Yes, I can. Okay. Can I try more esports related projects? Yes, I can. Can I make a whole career out of that and move over to Toronto?
Yeah,
okay, sure.
Not? Let's just go. Yeah. Let's go.
go wholehearted into that. Yeah. Okay. So tell us about after you got to Toronto then. What's been your path since then?
Since then, I've been trying to jump around doing all sorts of things, trying to get in the industry. Meet the people behind the scenes, meet the athletes that are trying to compete and make it big, trying to understand the way the system works. Like traditional sports, you have A, B, and C, and then pros, right? In esports, I kind of anticipated something similar. It was like A, B, C, you're pro. It's not. It's much more chaotic. It's much more. You're nobody until you're somebody, right? Like there's not that stepwise ladder like traditional sports has.
Would you agree with that, Casey?
Yeah, the path to the pros is a little more convoluted. It's undefined, I would say.
Yeah,
I know last week you had Mr. Stocks on.
That's right.
And he certainly touched on that. So it's certainly something that's developing as we go because things are coming to the forefront so quickly.
And it's kind of interesting too. It's like when you're working with a traditional sports athlete, and again, I was working in it a little bit before I went to esports. It's easier to keep someone's motivation high in traditional sports because they move from division to division to division. They have those accolades and those awards that they're getting to tell them that they're doing a good job. Where in esports, it's you have nothing again until you have something, right? Like you don't get that affirmation that you're doing the right thing. You don't get an award. You don't get the recognition. It's you're either nobody or you've made it to the big leagues. And so it's hard to keep that motivation for somebody going in esports just because they don't have those little benefits or those little perks of kind of to stimulate that motivation. So you have to dig deeper. You have to make them think harder and plan for a longer future than you would with a traditional sports athlete because you don't have those little steps.
Interesting. So let's go back a little bit to what you're doing these days. So now, like situated in Toronto, you've got Vertex up and you're working on it. What are you doing these days via Vertex?
Yeah. So my typical like work pattern that I work with people is more set along the lines of like a traditional counseling way. So I'll sit down with the athlete. We'll help establish their goals, their achievements that they want to get, where they're at right now, where they want to be. We'll start kind of working through their emotional states, figuring out how they've been acting, what's holding them back. It's kind of interesting how often the athletes don't recognize the same things or the things that are holding them back, even though it's very obvious. Like I've worked with a kid who has anger issues, doesn't realize that his anger is the thing that's holding him back. So you have to make it very clear to them, show them how it's impacting them, and then we come up with steps to go forward from that. But then even more on that, one of the things that caught me off guard is that there's a lot of general life skills coaching in esports, not as much mental performance as I was expecting. And I think that largely boils down to the fact that traditional sports has had that support system and that structure growing up. The kids have developed the ability to handle the pressure. They've learned how to cope with things, how to communicate with teammates. Where in esports, we're getting kids thrown into teams. We're getting kids kind of just like not learning those developmental stages. So you get kids that don't know how to plan their day properly. You get kids that don't know how to even like pack a bag for a trip, something like that, because they haven't done that traveling yet. So mental performance.
There's a lot of life skills that are involved. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so mental performance coaching isn't always just about handling someone's emotions or figuring out their cognitive issues. It's also trying to figure out like the psychosocial dynamics that are impacting them. Is there relational issues that are happening between you and your friends, your family? Are you struggling in school? Are you not feeling fulfilled in your hobbies? Like all these things kind of culminate and impact the way that your brain processes information and also relays information. And that can impact the way that you perform in game. So you have to really kind of like hit the whole spectrum in order to really get an athlete performing at their peak.
See, that's interesting to me. I never really considered that, it to have a mental performance coach come in and focus on somebody in esports. It's not just about the game that they're playing. It's about everything around it as well.
Yeah.
Both, in and out of the game. Now in the game, of course, is important, but I feel like you can't really have one without the other.
Well, it's like, imagine you're working with a 15-year-old kid that plays Fortnite, right?
Yeah.
It's likely that they're going through the first times in their life having like relationships with girls. They're also experiencing a lot of emotions that they don't know how to handle. When you throw first time relationships with a lot of emotions that they can't handle and trying to manage like a high performance career in esports, that's messy, because if anything goes wrong, if they're starting to get stressed out about their relationship, or they haven't, something as simple as like not getting a text that day from their partner means that they're stressed out. That stress carries over into esports, right? Like there isn't like this and that. It's all mixed together, and you have to be aware of all those other things that's impacting them. Otherwise, you're missing so much of the performance.
I see. Casey, is there anything specific that you've noticed kind of in your travels through the system?
I would say that a lot of people aren't aware of the skills that they're going to need to possess to perform at a high level, in the same way that Landon identified the emotional factors and things like that people don't consider. There's a lot of things within yourself, be it your vision or your cognitive ability, things that might be holding you back or you haven't worked on developing, that again, because you've spent 8, 10, 12 or upwards of that hours within the game, you've neglected to develop outside the game. And these are the things that if you build your house on stilts instead of a good foundation, eventually a strong wind will blow you over. So when you're playing guys who either have these skills already developed, or maybe they just possess different or supplemental things that you don't, and you're going up against them, then you're going to realize that sometimes your performance is often tied into the things that other people have that you don't. Now, everyone's different. We like to think that everyone has the ability to gain these skills in the same way they have the ability to develop the emotional intelligence that Landon refers to. Nobody is really hamstrung against the physical skills that we were discussing previously in traditional sports. These are things that most people really have the ability to develop and identify and so on. But they've neglected to realize what exactly it is that's holding them back.
Yeah. I got some to add on that.
Please.
He was mentioning something about like how kids play 8, 10, 12 hours a day in training. And it's kind of fascinating to me, because it's in traditional sports, you have that physical limit where after 3 hours, 4 hours, 2 hours, depending on the sport, you are physically incapable of training anymore because your body shut down. Your muscles have fatigued. You can't go anymore. In esports, it's a little bit of a different function too.
There's still some kind of diminishing returns.
They're
but
100%, but it's not noticeable as much, because it's like come 10, 12 hours of training, you don't have that physical limitation that's shutting you down. You still feel like you can train, right? And because you feel like you can train, you feel like you should be training.
Right.
And if you're not training, you're wasting time, you're not going pro. So trying to teach esport athletes that taking breaks is necessary is almost a skill in itself, because you don't have to teach traditional sports people to take breaks because their bodies forces them to. Where esports, they don't understand that those 12-hour days are hurting them, because your brain is like at a certain point no longer processing information the same way, and it's no longer doing the same degree of output, and you're no longer developing skill. Instead, you're hurting your social life, you're hurting your sleep schedule, you're hurting your nutrition patterns, you're hurting your ability to focus, you're hurting your ability to everything. Like you don't notice that because you feel normal, but your normal isn't always correct. Like your perception of normal isn't always correct.
Right, exactly.
So,
your perception of normal changes the longer that you've been, focusing on one thing and not allowing, control over the other things to happen.
If we were to look at you at like hour 1 and take an objective measurement of you, and then measure you at hour 12 and have an objective measurement, you would probably perceive yourself to be the same, but there would just be a drastic difference in performance and ability to focus and all sorts of different other measurements.
Interesting.
I think that ties hand in hand with something I used to be told. If you don't have a strong foundation built, then often people form bad habits in their performance. But the second place that you can actually form bad habits is if you're over fatigued, as you mentioned, and then you start taking shortcuts. So not only can you form these habits before you know what's the proper way to do it.
Yep.
But they also form once you've exhausted all your resources in performing the proper way, then the bad habits come back out. So not only can they be formed at the beginning, but as Landon mentioned, they can kind of be formed on the back end of like a training session or something like that,
Right.
where you've exhausted your normal resources and now you're using other things to lift the load. And then when game time comes, you go back to your most recent, which is the end of your previous training, instead of where you should have started or ended, which is in your good form.
I see. So it's not so much about, the peaks and valleys of, I was really good by hour 3 and then I dropped off at hour 5. It's about, creating a good average of this is pretty much where I'm consistently at every time that I go and play. And I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. You don't want to be spending a good, and time is one factor, but you don't want to be investing a lot of resources, be it time, be it mental effort. You don't want to be doing that, in a place where it's detrimental to you. And it's kind of about figuring out when those diminishing returns actually start.
Yeah.
Is from what I'm understanding.
Yeah.
Here.
And the term that I would use to call that is, or what I tell people is the optimal training zone.
Okay.
And so, like you said, you gotta figure out where you train best, how long you train best, and then stick within those parameters, because that's your most effective use of training. Outside of those parameters, you could be doing other things like taking care of all those other issues or working on other things. So you want to stick within your optimal training zones.
So to kind of pivot off of that, I like that idea, and I want to kind of pivot into more of a this how do we apply what we're talking about right now, and kind of the first thing that comes to mind when you mentioned optimal training zone is in traditional sports. When people stretching is such an undervalued thing in a lot of people when they're first starting to learn a sport or they're first starting to understand their bodies. What is a proper, is there a proper stretching equivalent in esports that you like to talk about or anything like that?
Yeah, I'll jump on this one.
Yeah.
I would equate stretching to sleep in a sense.
Okay.
Sleep is probably one of the most abused things in esports. It's not understood. It's almost like glorified to not sleep much, right? Like, how many times have you heard 2 people come up and be like, man, I was up till 4 and then I had to get up at 8.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Now look at it, I'm still doing good. I had 4 hours sleep. No, you're not. You're at your peak. But it's like not sleeping but still functioning is something you want to brag about. Like that's a misconception. That's hurting you as well. It's like to exercise proper sleep patterns is the stretching, right? Like that's the boring part where you're not really doing anything. You're sitting on the ground kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's massively impactful on helping your brain process information and be able to put that output out fast, right? Because your brain thinks incredibly fast, right? It happens in milliseconds. Esports also happens that the slightest change in that means you underperformed today.
See, and that's kind of what tripped me up before when I was speaking about time versus other resources is people equate, like you're saying, time to effort, and that's not entirely the case. The more time that you spend on something does not necessarily mean that you've spent the most effort or the most concentrated amount of effort. Taking breaks is just as important, and I totally agree with that.
And jump back
please.
with the sleep thing real quick. I was curious about how to work with people more effectively in that manner, and like how I approach esports with sleep patterns.
Right.
And so I got in contact with a clinical psychologist who specializes in sleep, and I wanted to ask his opinion because he also understands the esport world.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, how would I make an esport athlete go to bed early and get up early and do their practice? He's like, no, that's ridiculous. Don't think of it like that. You can't rip them out of like their optimal training zones, right? That's why I jumped. He's like, esports exists at night. Don't try and pull them out of there. You're gonna get resistance. You're gonna get backlash, and you're gonna lose your job. He's like, you have to meet them in their training zones. If they're going to bed at 4, that's fine, but get them to always go to bed at 4. Like have their
consistency,
have their training schedules line up with their sleep pattern, or have their sleep patterns line up with their training schedule. So if they typically practice with their team or their friends or whatever it might be until 2 or 3 in the morning, and then they go to bed at 4, help them plan their days around that. So they then sleep till noon, and they do that every day. So don't try to rip them out of their optimal training zones. Try to find a way to get consistent 8-hour sleeps within their time frame. And so that really changed their perspective, because I'm no longer trying to tell people that they should be going to bed at 10, 11, or 12. I'm saying if you're staying up till 3, you're sleeping 8 hours, so you're getting up at 11.
Right. And so this is specifically for people who are pursuing this as like a full-time kind of situation. I assume it's a little harder when people are balancing, jobs or school or anything else kind of around that. But
yeah, I mean, I think people should guard their sleep like it's a religion.
For
I
sure.
think if you're getting consistently less than 7 or 6, even on the lower end, you're damaging your brain a little bit. Especially if you are looking to go pro in esports, you have to do that. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard for you to remain at the top. If you get to the top, it'll be hard for you to remain there because you'll burn out very quickly. And that's part of the reason why we have seen such a big burnout, is because of factors like that. Not just sleep, but sleep will contribute to it, where the top elites might not have proper sleeping patterns and their brain is burning out, and then they're losing the ability to focus for a long period of time. They're getting angry at their teammates because they don't have to sleep, and so that's a contributing factor to burnout. And so if we can kind of like shift that in elites where they're not going to bed early per se, but they have their consistent sleep pattern, then we're moving in the right direction.
Okay.
I think that goes kind of hand in hand with kind of like practice how you play and play how you practice. So as you said, if the ecosystem is operating at night, then you should plan accordingly. You can go to bed later and get up later, as long as maybe if you practice from this time to that time, then when it's time to compete, it should overlay. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else that you would kind of equate to stretching?
I think sleep would probably be the primary one. Mm-hmm. Obviously, nutrition's an important one too. I know there's like a perception around gamers like Mountain Dew and Doritos. Yeah. But certainly nutrition is important too. You got to feed your brain the same way you have to rest it with sleep. So I think just the standard things that actually this might be a good parallel for traditional sports, where you have to eat right, you have to hydrate correctly, you have to sleep well. These are all things that will contribute to your, as you said, optimal performance. Yeah. But I think those things actually go hand in hand.
So it's all mostly lifestyle rather than, say, one specific moment in time that you need to prepare to get yourself to a certain point.
Well, there is one thing that I'll do consistently with, and this is a little bit when you're moving up the ladder, not so much the very amateur, but when you're getting to more of like the semi-amateur or semi-pro, is the concept of pre-performance routines. That would probably, in terms of like a direct comparison, be the closest to stretching. And what a pre-performance routine is it's a set of kind of rituals or habits or thoughts or visualization that you go through before practice or before competition. Yeah. And the purpose of it is it's like conditioning your brain almost. So when you do pattern A, B, and C, then your brain is primed to do the result, right? So like look at a prime example of this is Michael Phelps in the Olympics. He's one that most sports psychologists and mental performance coaches will talk about, because he often, before competition, kind of like slips aside, throws a towel over his head, throws earbuds in, and then he gets in the zone because he practices visualization in that moment. So he's listening to specific tunes. I don't know which music he listens to, but that's very unique to each person. But then he visualizes his breaststroke, or he visualizes whatever swim pattern he's in for the day, and he's watching that process and experiencing it in his mind, and he's preparing his mind to do those behaviors.
So to kind of draw another parallel, I've heard of rather famously a tennis player, is it Federer, who has a couple like very specific things that he does. Yeah. Like he always, taps his ear a couple times and does like, Nadal. Thank you. Yeah. Rafael Nadal.
So that is essentially a pre-performance routine, or sometimes it happens in the middle of a match. And what that is it looks ritualistic, and it looks kind of like,
it looks like a complex, but it's not.
What it's doing is kind of triggering your brain into a specific thought process. Right. So it's like he does this, this, and this, and now his brain has just kind of like associated that with performance. So when I'm working with somebody in esports, it'll be like let's use League of Legends for example. I'm working with the League of Legends pro, and they're starting to get stressed out before match, or like that's one of the things that they struggle with. And when they get stressed out, they start missing CS. So before the match, what we'll do is we'll find his optimal kind of zone. We'll get him, whether it's a side or if he's on the stage or whatever, we'll teach him how to do some like visualization training. So he's watching himself execute CSing perfectly in his mind. It's kind of preparing him for that process of it, so that when he goes in, he's already warmed up for it and he's already prepared for it. And so that's kind of like stressing you're warming up your brain muscle essentially to do whatever it needs to do without getting overworked.
I see.
Yeah, I think sometimes also if you like watch hockey, you'll see a goalie sitting on the bench and having his eyes sort of dart as if he were following the puck,
right?
Because his primary function is to follow the
is
puck,
to do that,
and get in front of it. So as you said with Nadal, sort of things like that, movement, eye tracking, things that your cognitive abilities will be primed to do, as you said, when it's time to play.
Yeah, or even something as simple in like a battle royale when you're like Fortnite, while you're dropping in. If you do the visualization process of dropping in before it actually happens, your brain is like primed to drop in and get ready for the match. And it kind of it helps you get in the zone faster. And if you want to talk, like to use a buzzword, if you want to hit that flow state quicker, that's one of the ways that you can do it.
It's getting yourself in the game before you're even in the game.
Yeah.
I understand that. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. I think that's a good place for us to take a break. When we come back, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the application process of getting into the right headspace in esports. So that's what we're going to do when we come back in just a second. You're purely PC now?
Yeah. It's easier. Like you don't have to haul the system around or anything. Like I don't know. The only thing I play really is League of Legends and Apex. So
and
RuneScape,
obviously.
And so there's nothing I would really play on the console other than like Halo.
Yeah. Do you play anything?
I used to play a lot of sports games on console.
Oh yeah.
I've fallen off a bit. Just based on the real world responsibilities that we all carry now.
I feel that.
I used to be pretty proficient at NHL and Madden, NHL especially. Right. I wonder what the physics engine looks like in that.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. I remember I used to play this game, RBI Baseball, if you're familiar, where if you use the D-pad, you like control all the left side or the right side of the infield at once. So if you're moving people, say, to the right and the ball gets by your third baseman, well, now your left fielder has to go left. So you have to switch everyone's movement all at once. But naturally, you're not thinking that way. You're trying to get the ball in the 5.5 hole. But now you've got to port your operations over and control everyone to go in the opposite direction. So there's a bit of a learning curve to playing that game. And I feel like NHL 94 carries that same.
Was that something that was that like a mechanic that was ported over to other sports games as well? Because I feel like I don't see a lot where you can control halves.
Not that I know of. I'm pretty sure that's the only game that it exists like that. And I remember I got a gift for a birthday of like an original Xbox and I put a bunch of emulators on it. Hopefully I don't get chased down for this. But me and my brother used to play RBI Baseball, and just getting back into it, like the learning curve was pretty strong, trying to adjust to all these old school things, all the mechanics.
Are there any like old games that you've played that you're now seeing that like still have communities kind of going on?
Well, I had a GameCube for a bit, so as you said,
Smash.
That Super Smash Brothers game. Otherwise, there's a classic out there, MVP Baseball 2005. Used to have Manny Ramirez on the cover,
nodding his head. Yeah,
that is like the baseball game. People try and replicate it now with the show and all the other ones that come out. But that was like the Paramount when I was a kid. That was the be all and end all of baseball games. I feel like it still is, but as a purist, I haven't gone back into the other ones, the newer ones, because I'm loyal to my guy. Otherwise, I don't know. That depends. I would say like the original console, like things like Mario and Donkey Kong, maybe not the head-to-head, but
the stuff that never like leaves you.
Yeah, exactly. Those, like, I'll always enjoy playing Donkey Kong Country or Sonic 2 for Sega Genesis. I used to come home every day after kindergarten and like grade 1 and just beat Sonic 2.
Yeah.
And then one day I came home and my Genesis just wouldn't turn on. I think we're talking about burnout and load management. I did not apply those to my kindergarten self when it came to Sonic 2.
Doesn't it sound like your system burned out before you?
Well, that's young when you're that young. Exactly. You're not feeling fatigue when you're that young. You're good to go. So I guess that was that's true. I outlasted it.
You know what's two really good games though? These are my OG NES games. Is Mega Man 2.
Absolutely.
Or oh my god.
Oh, I'm 100% with you on that one.
I sometimes think about that. I'll be sitting there And then speaking of like visualization stuff, I'll just start playing Mega Man in my head. I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
or TMNT, like Teenage Mutant Ninja
Turtles in Time?
2.
Yeah.
No, number 2. Or
Okay.
it was-
TMNT 2.
I think it was number 2.
Yeah, I
at
don't
least.
remember which one that was, but yeah, okay.
It was pure beautiful.
Yeah.
It was,
Was that one an arcade game? Before it was a... I don't remember.
I think this was the second. I think the first one was the arcade game.
Okay.
I've seen this one on the arcade since then, but I think that's like modern day remakes of it. But
So I love this specific conversation. So I'm going to actually have put all of this. Welcome back, people. I'm glad you got to kind of come in halfway through, and I'm glad that I hit record for this one. So thank you, Casey, for prompting me to do
we're
that.
recording.
Yeah. We've been recording for the past 5 minutes. So we're going to keep a little bit of that in. I want to keep talking about the games that we do play before we get back into the mental performance side of things. So what mainly are you playing now, Landon?
I've been doing League of Legends almost nonstop for the
yeah?
past 8 years, give or take. Like
Really?
it is my game to the core. I love it. I'm not the best at it.
Mhm.
Over past year or so, since I've been working in esports, it's actually declined in my rank. But
Right.
that's just because by the
That's
time
just how things go.
well, by the time I get home after dealing with competitive esports all day,
course.
I don't want to try too hard. So
Yeah.
I keep a competitive level, but I don't go too hard.
How do you feel about like team fight tactics and all that?
I don't like it.
Oh, really?
No.
Tell me why.
I feel like it's. Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble for this.
Uh-oh.
I feel like it's an inherently boring game that can't last long
I see.
because it's actionless.
It is
Like
pretty actionless.
like when you think of sports, what's the most popular games? And sports are usually action based. You don't get things like chess, right? Like chess has its cult following. They love it, but when you're looking at competitive games, setting up a board and watching it go isn't going to draw large spectator crowds for a very long time.
To defend the other side of that, though, that sounds like somebody who doesn't watch chess in general.
I got called
so
out.
the people who are into chess would say, I am a part of that cult following.
They've turned us off.
Yeah. I just
They've demonstrated
It's already gone. Yeah,
All
so
right.
it's fine.
I'll just give you guys my address. So you
Please,
guys
go
can
ahead.
come fight me.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Starlight
That's
Lane.
I
It's a
don't think
good
it's a bad
DM,
game.
yeah.
I don't think it's gonna last as a competitive game.
Do you think
And
there's going to be the same kind of cult following that chess has had?
No,
Really?
auto battlers in general, they just
You think it'll fall off?
they're exciting to watch at first, but then the gameplay is very like stagnant. Not stagnant. That's the wrong term. It's very repetitive in a sense. Like you watch a League of Legends game and it changes a lot, and it like just the macro and micro plays and the strategy and thinking behind it. But when you watch like TFT or what's it, Overlords, whatever, Underlords, it's just less varying when it comes.
I see what
and
you're saying.
Not saying that it won't get a competitive scene. It very much could, because this is just my opinion, and I obviously everybody has their own bias. So this could just be my bias showing here. I think it's cool. I just don't think it's necessarily like a competitive game.
It has a very clear and defined meta to it.
Yeah.
Which is a lot less diverse, I will say, than things like League of Legends or things like Dota.
Yeah.
So I can appreciate that opinion, and I think that there is some validity in that.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, TFT does its part to add in as much variety into the game, like adding things apart from just the units, like adding like little tiles that do different things depending on what game you play. Like it's a whole thing. But I do see kind of the staleness of it kind of creeping up on auto battlers already.
But to defend it too, it does have a lot of strategy to it. Like there is depth to it. It's not like an auto battler on a mobile game. Those ones I don't really have much for strategy. TFT and Underlords, they do have strategy to them, and they do have complexity. So like I do get why some people absolutely love it. And I mean, at the end of the day, play what you love. That's what it boils down to. Yeah. I like weird things too. Like I watch people play RuneScape. I don't play it, but I watch people play RuneScape, and I love it. Like who cares? You just enjoy, do what you love.
You know?
Do what you love. So if you love TFT, play TFT nonstop.
I mean, Minecraft has a huge following online. Not
Exactly.
all of those people who play Minecraft. So, Casey, what kind of games are you playing these days, if any?
At the risk of further alienating
Please.
ourselves from the listeners and a divisive comment for everyone out there, I don't play that many games currently.
Okay.
I still dabble with like a little bit of sports games, but in the same way that's sort of stepping onto a Major League Baseball field and having a pitcher blow fastballs by you and not really gaining anything from the experience, I sort of think that my attempts to play these games that I'm working to understand has actually sort of thrown me even farther away from the epicenter of understanding what's going on.
Really?
So what I have been doing, however, is what I do is I watch some streamers who are actually sort of like mic'd up athletes, and they sort of talk their way through the gameplay, which helps me gain a window into their insights and their methodology, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the streamers out there are using this platform not only to gain viewers and whatnot, but they almost talk through their thought process.
Right.
Which, coming from traditional sports, having learned the game when I was excessively young, it's kind of like speaking the language. But if you get off a plane in a foreign country, you're not really going to get what anyone's saying.
Right.
None of the native speakers. So I sort of missed the boat as far as being a native gamer in any of these platforms or these different titles. But I use an interpreter, which is what I like to refer to the streamers as for me, to sort of bridge the language barrier, so to speak, between myself and the elite performer and the esports athlete.
I will say that with a lot of the games that I'm interested in, I'm a big fan of the strategy games like Pokemon and like Hearthstone and card games in general. I've found that looking at those people, those kind of streamers who will talk through their thought process has been wildly helpful. To me, that's how I learn. I learn through other people kind of explaining how the game works and how their thought process goes. There are some people who learn the other way. There are some people who watch a streamer to just watch them be really good at the game, and they pick up their moves and they pick up their, like, the streamer doesn't have to be talking at all. They can just be watching good gameplay and be like, okay, I think I get it. So I completely can sympathize with that. That makes a lot of sense to me. Mm-hmm. So what I wanted to kind of get into, I want to talk a little bit more about how a amateur, a person who thinks that they're really good at a game, a person who really wants to start practicing and try and make it pro. I want to talk a little bit more about what kind of things they can do to kind of up their game before they even start playing the game, kind of like we mentioned. So we've already spoken about things like practice and a training regimen. Is there anything else that either of you guys, and I'll open the floor up to both of you, maybe we can have a little conversation about it together. Is there anything that you guys tend to focus on with these kind of people? Because I assume that these type of people are your main clients, right? So I want to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I would say this is actually sort of Boxout's one of their areas of expertise, sort of our bread and butter. As I said before, a strong performer starts on a strong foundation, and the skills that you're using to microprocess, identify, and carry out these instincts and maneuvers that your brain is trying to send to your hands effectively in esports is exactly what Boxout is sort of pioneering. I like to think. I haven't seen that many other people out in the space that do what we do. Mm-hmm. There's like little segments of it, but ultimately I haven't found that anyone is really touching on all the things that we are. So I would say, firstly, it starts with our visual sensory training. We put you through a certain test that identifies not only your visual clarity, which is a test that you would get at an optometrist. They would be able to tell you have 20/20 vision or whatnot. Mm-hmm. So we identify not only your visual clarity. A lot of people think that 20/20 vision is actually perfect, whereas it's been proven that that's really just average. That means from 20 feet, I could see what the average person can also see from 20 feet.
Is that what those 20...
Correct.
Those numbers mean? Really?
Yes, a lot of big misconceptions.
I had no idea.
An individual with 20/20 vision is merely a person who sees on an average basis. With that being said, it can go as low as 7/20, which would be 3 times better than the average person, which means that I can see from 20 feet what the average person would need to go to 7 feet to see the same detail, the same clarity, and gather the same information that I can get.
Oh,
yes.
Wow. Okay.
So in traditional sports, the elite performer usually lays between 20 over 9 and 20 over 13. So that is like the wheelhouse of what an elite traditional sports athlete has. 20 over 7 is the best they've ever seen. Those are like guys who are transcendent at what they do for the most part, at least on a visual sense. So we start off not only with identifying your visual clarity, but also things like your depth perception, which again in esports is paramount. How far is this object? How far is this opponent? Things like that. Your contrast sensitivity. So everyone knows that lighting in different arenas and the contrast on different monitors changes. You don't always get to bring your monitor from home, and you don't always get to tell the guy, hey, raise the lighting or lower it a bit. You come into the building you're in, and the lighting and the contrast affects your gameplay. So you can actually train your eyes to recognize slight variances in contrast, as opposed to just, oh, I'm in this building, I got to make the best of it. Beyond that, we also do things like multiple object tracking, obviously paramount as well. The average traditional sports athlete, they say, can track up to over 100 moving objects at one time, and that's ultimately what they have to do. Say if you're playing basketball, you need to track the opponent's feet, their hands, the clock, all the players on your team, the officials, maybe your coach is calling a play. So ultimately, if you're not able to track all these moving objects at once, which in esports obviously is paramount as well, multiple opponents, multiple teammates, your orientation on the map, these are things that you're going to need to be able to improve your ability to recognize and track.
Okay.
So these are just some of the visual skills that we're able to train, along with things like your hand-eye coordination, which is obviously paramount as well. Beyond that, we move to over 50 cognitive abilities. Things like your perception of spatial, of visual, your auditory perception. Your people are going to be in your ear. You're going to be wearing your headset, teammates talking, noises going off, everything. You're going to be able to discern small differences in that. You're going to be able to train your ability not only to recognize those things, but your ability to process them at a high speed, which again, we believe is paramount to a strong mental performer. And then beyond that, you're going to need to deploy the best decision-making after all this stimulus comes in. They say 90% of the information you process comes in through your eyes.
Right.
And your brain processes over 100 gigabytes of information every second.
Jeez.
So ultimately,
that's intense.
yes, exactly. So there's a lot of moving parts going on. And we're kind of trying to align the individuals who are trying to align all these moving parts at once.
Sure.
To give them the best tools to do so.
Okay, so let's get into the application of that. With people who are at home right now, people who have taken a break from their game to listen to this podcast, or they're on their way to something listening to this podcast, what are some simple steps that they can be doing right now to kind of up their game?
Well, outside of our system, I guess it would be sort of awareness.
Yeah.
Realize how many things you're doing at once. If you're walking, if you're driving, maybe you're on your bike. Yeah. Think about how many things you're considering at once, be it cars on the road, the traffic lights, the conditions of the road itself, the condition of your car, the speed you're going. These are all things that involve hundreds, if not thousands of variables in any given moment.
Yeah.
And they're all dynamic. They're all changing at every second. But when we get in a car and you get behind the wheel, or maybe you're riding a bike or you're on another mode of transportation, you just say, oh, I'm a good driver. But nobody really cares to unpack the granular reasons why someone's good at that.
I see.
And that's exactly what we're trying to touch on. So I guess it starts with awareness.
Yeah.
If you know exactly what you're applying, the skills, be it cognitive, visual, or psychological, then you'll know kind of how to train. With that being said, a lot of the training that we do takes place exclusively on our system.
Got it.
So beyond that, I would say.
So once you're ready to kind of take that next step and introduce a third party to kind of get you there, that's when people would go to Boxout, or even before then to try and like get people to, develop the whole way through.
Precisely. Yeah. I would say that once you're ready to go, there might be other utilities out there. I don't think there are the ones, all the ones that we tie in to one suite.
Sure.
That we were able to deploy. But yeah, I would say it starts with awareness outside of actually going to boxoutperformance.com and looking us up.
There it is.
Boxoutperformance.com.
Boxoutperformance.com. Landon, let's talk with you for a bit. Landon, what kind of things can people be doing right now? What kind of free advice can you be giving out right now?
All right, I got a few.
Oh my gosh!
Here.
I see the smile.
We'll see where we get to, and we'll start somewhere. So I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Boxout and Vertex are very parallel, but they're just like there's a little bit of difference there. I'd put Boxout more on the side of sports science, and Vertex more on the side of sports psychology.
I would agree with the bullet.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like they're unbelievably complementary systems there. Like you'll see in traditional sports, those two things are almost necessary to exist together. Like that's how it works. So on my side of things, in terms of things you can be doing, is I'm going to jump back to one of the things I said earlier is understanding basic life skills that are holding you back first. That's in esports, that is one of the number one things. And it would be hard to exactly give advice on which ones it is without meeting the person, because every person has their unique needs. But taking a few minutes, maybe once a week or whatever, to try and assess what's wasted your time this week, what's held you back. Has there been some kind of barrier in your normal life that's been impacting your game? And try and assess that. And at first, it's gonna be very difficult to try and see those things because it's just hard to understand that at first. Sure. But yeah, if you do it every week and you do it consistently, you'll start noticing patterns of, oh my goodness, I wasted 3 hours on Tuesday doing this. Why didn't I get here? So you've missed those life skills. Or if you went somewhere and you failed to pack a bag correctly, oh shoot, there you go. There's another thing. Like what happens if I have to go on a tournament? Like trying to understand those things that are holding you back in general life. Or even number one is start tracking your sleep too, right? Like as I mentioned earlier, that could be a huge factor and that's holding you back. So start monitoring your sleep. If you have an Apple smartwatch or a Fitbit, they track your sleep cycles and how long you were asleep and whatnot. So you can use those things to try and help you get better at general life. Okay. I know I get better at general life sounds weird, but there is a lot of things that hold people back just because they don't do it well.
There are things out there that people can be using as resources.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense.
So that'd be my number one thing. I think another good thing is ask your teammates what's holding you back, right? Because you have your own bias, right? Like if you and I are on a team, I might think that everything is happening wrong with you. I'm not really taking a look at what's going on with me. But your teammates are. I guarantee your teammates know what you're doing wrong. Yeah. Ask them for advice. Say, where am I slipping up when we practice? Have you noticed that I do anything? Am I getting angry all the time? And when you ask that, go in it expecting to get criticism. Like they're going to be confronting you on something, so you can't lash out at them. If you ask them for help and they tell you that something's wrong, accept that and then start trying to make a plan. Even ask them for, how can I work on that? What would you like to see me do? So if you don't have access to somebody like me who can help you with those kind of things, like ask your teammates, ask your coach, ask people around you, even ask your parents, your teacher, your friends. They all can help you start working on things that you don't necessarily notice about yourself. So that would be like advice number 2.
Yeah, that would certainly help with not only intrapersonal advice, but interpersonal. Yeah, I'm sure they'll tell you in relation to them as your teammate, how maybe you could help team chemistry or relate to them.
Like how many times have you, as an athlete, I'm speaking to the audience here, how many times have you been playing with your duo or your squad or your team or whatnot, and you've noticed when your teammate does something wrong, right? Like it's very obvious to you when somebody else does something wrong.
Might not be obvious to them.
Yeah, it works both ways. It's very obvious to them when you do something wrong. So go to them for help. Right. And don't think that it's them attacking you. It's constructive criticism. This is how we grow. We have to understand our mistakes so that we can go forward.
You can't always edit your own essay.
Exactly.
Very good.
I like that a
lot.
You
wouldn't have written it if you didn't think it was right, but that doesn't mean it is, and other people will see that.
Yeah. And also I think to put a positive flip on that as well, ask your teammates what you're doing right, because then you can continue feeding that. So don't just focus on the negatives. Like if you ask your teammate, what am I doing wrong? They're like, you're angry, blah, blah, blah. You also ask them, what am I doing right? And they're like, you're a great shot caller. That's amazing. Like you're doing good. Like get that positive feedback as well, because that helps boost your confidence. So doing both those things is actually probably pretty effective.
Correct your negatives, develop your positives.
Yeah, exactly. Like life isn't about just negatives. It's not, growth isn't just about focusing on what's wrong. It's also about focusing on what you're doing right and continuing that pattern.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed that. Before we go, I just want to roll out the red carpet for you guys. Casey, is there any place that people can find you? Is there anything that people should be directed to? The floor is yours.
I would say just our site is a good place to start, boxoutperformance.com. It'll give you an insight not only into how individual esports athletes and esports teams can sort of help us to deploy our systems and improve their performance, but also organizations, teams, colleges have now ported their operations over from club to varsity.
Right.
So a lot of them fall under the AD and things like that. So not only are we helping to improve individual athletes, but we're helping organizations with things like identification, recruiting, and selecting of prospects who are soon going to be getting these big scholarships. I think it seems like they're moving towards that, to sort of get a data and science driven backing to their selection process. Once we get in there, then we like to help them train the athletes, not only from an individual skills perspective, but as I said, an interpersonal and team perspective. You can't have 5 guys with the exact same strength and same weaknesses playing on the same team, or else your shortcomings will be evident. I'm sure you've heard you're only as strong as your weakest link. Right. Well, if your weakest link is evident and everyone's stacked against it, then guess what? You're going to get attacked there. Mm-hmm. So we're helping with that. And then as Landon kind of touched on, where he is deploying the mental health and the things like that, we sort of assist in the identification of some mental health things and some load management, which is a new term that people are becoming familiar with. Mm-hmm. Landon is certainly far and away the expert in my eyes, at least in contrast to myself, at deploying this. But identifying it is something that we're capable of from a complementary sense in his approach. So that's really what we're about.
Okay. And then Landon, red carpet is yours. Where can people find you? Where can people find Vertex?
Yeah, probably the 2 best places right now is on my website, which is vertex-performance.com.
Okay.
Or at Vertex Psych on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Those are probably the 2 number 1 places. I post some useful things on Twitter here and there sometimes. And
can't give away the fun, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Just little teasers.
I've also seen you rather active on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, that was going to be my next one. LinkedIn. I don't know how many people in the audience might be using it, LinkedIn or LinkedIn, but you can find me at Landon Gorbenko on LinkedIn.
There you go.
There I post usually a little bit more comprehensive things or things of experience. I usually plug my blog that I write, trying to do at least once a week. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it doesn't happen, but plug my blog there so you can get tips on like how to combat mental fatigue, or the difference between, one of my recent ones is the difference between ego and confidence and how to kind of manage the 2 of those things.
Is there one that you're particularly proud of right now that you would direct people to? One specific blog post?
LinkedIn is kind of like,
LinkedIn for sure. But one specific blog post.
That ego confidence thing seems like a valuable.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like you said earlier, you can't edit your own essay. Like, I like all my blogs, right? Like,
I'll come on next week and I'll do some reading.
I'll let you know.
My blog coming up this next week is going to be about performance profiling for esports athletes. It's a little bit of an old kind of tool in sports. I'm going to try and adapt it for esports. Mm-hmm. I'm working on that right now. We're going to see how that turns out. Who knows? It might not work out great. It might work out awesome. We'll find out in my blog next week.
There you go.
So keep your eyes for that. I will link it on both LinkedIn and Twitter. So
perfect. All right. And then as for us, you can find us on Instagram at BO3Podcast, on Twitter at BO3Podcast. You can email us at bo3@organizedgaming.co. And then, of course, you can find us wherever you find your podcasts. Guys, it would mean a lot if you could share this with at least one friend. I'm sure you have somebody in your life who needs or who could benefit from some kind of push in the direction of awareness. So please do yourself a favor, do your friends a favor, and share this podcast. Do us a favor and share this podcast. And we will see you next week with what will be the finale of season 1 of Best of 3. We'll see you next week. Bye.